Hi, everyone. My name is Brian Zip. I am the CEO at Concordia AI. So last summer, there was a debate in the West on whether China should be invited to attend the first Global AI Safety Summit at the Bletchley Park. We thought there was more room for productive discussions between China and other major AI powers on AI safety. So we decided to write a report on the state of AI safety in China and began communicating our views with relevant policymakers and stakeholders. At the end, China was invited. We published a report, and I had the privilege to attend the summit as part of the Chinese expert delegation. Seeing the ministers from China and the US on the same stage and announcing the Bletchley Declaration with other countries was a big highlight for me in 2023. In the following months, there was a number of other developments on international cooperation. President Xi Jinping met with President Biden in San Francisco, and one of the major outcomes was that they agreed to launch intergovernmental talks on AI, including the topic on AI safety. The first meeting of the dialogue occurred just yesterday, and I'm sure that we will discuss this in greater depth during the panel. And when the US initiated the first UN General Assembly resolution on AI, 120 countries, including China, co-sponsored the idea. So it is with this context that we published the spring edition report of the state of AI safety in China, and I'm looking forward to sharing it with delegates when I attend the AI Summit in Seoul next week. In this webinar, we'll spend about 10 minutes introducing key takeaways for this report before opening up to an excellent panel discussion. I'm especially glad to see so many of my respected peers and friends joining the panel: Jeff, Angela, Matt, and Robert. It was a true honor to receive all of your RSVPs within just 24 hours after we sent the invite. So we will leave about 10 minutes at the end for audience questions. Now I will hand it over to Jason, who led the update of the spring 2024 version of the report.
Thank you, Brian. I'm going to share my slides and we'll do a quick introduction to the key takeaways from the report. So someone let me know, please, if you can see the slides properly. Great. So thank you for your introduction. So I put two quotations on this slide. If anyone can recognize either quote or can guess where each one comes from, feel free to put it in the Q&A box. I will read each quote, and yeah, please don't cheat. So quote one, artificial intelligence is a new area of human development. Currently, the fast development of AI around the world has exerted profound influence on socioeconomic development and the progress of human civilization and brought huge opportunities to the world. However, AI technologies also bring about unpredictable risks and complicated challenges. The governance of AI, a common task faced by all countries in the world, bears on the future of humanity. Quote two, artificial intelligence holds extraordinary potential for both promise and peril. Responsible AI use has the potential to help solve urgent challenges while making our world more prosperous, productive, innovative, and secure. At the same time, irresponsible use could exacerbate societal harms such as fraud, discrimination, bias, and disinformation, displace and disempower workers, stifle competition, and pose risks to national security. Harnessing AI for good and realizing its myriad benefits requires mitigating its substantial risks. So if anyone in the Q&A box has any, let's see, someone suggested that the first quote was from the statement, was from the UK Safety Summit. Actually, it is not taken from there. Let's see, it's the only guess we have right now. So I'm going to reveal it. Let's see, one more guess. Let's see. Number two is the White House executive order. Yep, that is correct. So the first quote is from China's Global AI Governance Initiative, and quote two is from the US White House Executive Order on AI. Now, I think if you look at the underlying content in each, it is almost identical. And I think if you made comparisons among most countries globally regarding their fundamental language on this issue, it would be largely the same. As AI systems have improved in leaps and bounds in the previous 3 years, countries around the world have become more aware of the safety risks, and China is no exception. The UK AI Safety Summit last year focused on these so-called frontier AI systems, which appear to pose some of the most significant threats. And this term refers to cutting-edge foundation models like GPT 3.5 and beyond, as well as AI systems in narrowly dangerous domains such as scientific research or bioengineering. And these are the systems that are the subject of our report today. Especially with the first meeting of the China-US intergovernmental talks on AI yesterday, we think that it's more important than ever to improve the quality of discourse on China's role in AI safety and international governance. It is all too easy to revert to simplistic narratives, and despite the efforts of the excellent scholars on this panel, to add nuance to the discussion. And in our remaining time, I will run through our key findings. So at the 2023 Beijing Academy of AI conference and at the Concordia AI hosted forum at that conference, OpenAI CEO Sam Altman called for technical cooperation with China, saying that solving alignment for advanced AI systems requires the best minds from around the world. The substantial increase that we saw in our report in the relevance and quality of Chinese technical research for frontier AI safety over just the past 6 months further reflects, in our view, the promise of Chinese research to contribute to this field. So we actually collected an extensive database of these papers that we are also making public. And the average number of papers per month has grown from 6 papers per month in the first 7 months to 15 papers per month over the last 6 months. So a substantial increase. And they also have begun to tackle more interesting topics, such as large language model unlearning, misuse risks of AI in biology and chemistry, evaluating power seeking and self-awareness risks of LLMs. And the trend over the past 6 months, we think, has been quite positive and highlights the potential for Chinese researchers to make valuable contributions to the field of AI safety. On the international stage, there are a number of major developments to key in on. Of course, Brian mentioned China's decision to sign the Bletchley Declaration, which was a major signal. And even though that sort of feels like ages ago in a world that is time dilated by AI, this declaration was probably unthinkable to many in early 2023. By all indications, China continues to be actively engaged in the AI summit process, including the International Scientific Report on Advanced AI Safety, which Kuan Yi is actually a writer for. And China has continued to highlight ensuring AI safety and control as a core international governance position. It was listed as the second of 3 ensures by Foreign Minister Wang Yi during an interview at the 2 sessions earlier this year. Though reporting about the AI dialogue between China and the US is still sparse at the moment, I'm definitely glad that this channel exists now to allow both countries to explore mutual understanding on AI safety. Domestically, China's national policy and leadership have shown growing interest in developing large models, but also in balancing with risk prevention. And one essay by the Minister of Science and Technology, pictured here, calls for equal emphasis on development and governance, highlighting this point. We've also seen unofficial expert drafts come out of China's forthcoming national AI law, which are focused around promoting AI development, but also contain various provisions on AI safety, such as specialized oversight for foundation models and stipulating value alignment of AGI. At the local level, we've seen governments in China's 3 biggest AI hubs testing policies on AGI or large models, including around topics like international cooperation, ethics, and testing and evaluation. So clearly, China's massive bureaucratic engine is turning to confront some of these frontier AI risks. Now, even though the government is certainly a dominant force in China, we cannot overlook what the industry is up to as well. And we've seen several influential industry associations establish projects or committees to research AI safety and security problems, one of which is the Artificial Intelligence Industry Alliance of China, which created a Safety and Security Governance Committee, which Concordia AI is a part of. And they recently issued an AI safety benchmark, which Jeff Ding actually translated, and it mostly focuses on content and data security, but also includes testing AI for consciousness, including anti-humanity tendencies and appealing for rights. So we could see industry consortiums become a repository for expertise on AI safety and testing and evaluation. Meanwhile, several AI safety topics have also begun to gain purchase among influential Chinese experts over the last 6 months, including red lines that AI must not cross to avoid existential risks, minimum funding levels for AI safety research, and AI's impact on biosecurity. So taking that second topic, academic or industry figures, including 01.ai founder Kai-Fu Lee, Tsinghua Dean and former Baidu president Zhang Yaqing, and BAI founding chairman Zhang Hongdiang, have all expressed support for companies allocating a minimum of 10 to 20% of resources to AI governance, safety, and ethics. And the latter two have also engaged in dialogue on this point at the International Dialogue on AI Safety, where Robert also participated in. So this discussion has also echoed afterwards in the Chinese discourse, with one of the provisions in the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences model AI law providing a tax credit for safety and governance work by AI developers. So it's an interesting development. So I hope, in conclusion, I guess, I hope that our report and additional resources can contribute to ongoing discussions around AI safety. And we highlight how China's efforts to combat frontier AI risks have intensified, particularly in scientific research, expert advocacy, and international diplomacy just over the last 6 months. So to close, ignoring or sidelining China is not the answer. And thank you for listening to this presentation, and over now to our fantastic panel.
Thank you, Jason. So my name is Kuan-Yi Ng. I work as a senior program manager at Concordia AI, and I will be your moderator for this discussion. We'll delve deeper into some of the themes regarding AI in China that Jason mentioned in the presentation, then expand beyond that to discuss the international AI safety landscape more broadly. And I'd be very hard-pressed to think of better people than our panelists to join us for this discussion. Besides my colleague Jason, we have Jeffrey Ding, who's an assistant professor of political science at George Washington University. Previously, Jeff was a fellow at Stanford's Center for International Security and Cooperation, and his research agenda centers on technological change and international politics. Of all panelists, I think I've known Jeff for the longest when we met in 2019, when he was still at the University of Oxford. As I'm sure many in our audience would know, Jeff is also very well known for his excellent China AI newsletter, which I believe has an incredible 20,000 subscribers now. And Jeff, you've really set a high bar for Concordia's own Substack here. Also joining us, we have Angela Zhang. She's an associate professor of law and director of the Philip K.H. Wong Center for Chinese Law at the University of Hong Kong. Widely recognized as a leading authority on Chinese tech regulation, Angela has written extensively on this topic, and her latest book, High Wire: How China Regulates Big Tech and Governs Its Economy, was released earlier this year. I want to state for the record here that I've proudly bought and have read Angela's book. I'm guessing many in our audience who are interested in the state of AI safety in China are also interested in China's tech regulation, so I really urge audience members to also pick up this book. Our third panelist is Robert Traeger. Robert is the co-director of the Oxford Martin AI Governance Initiative, international governance lead at the Center for the Governance of AI, and senior research fellow at the Blavatnik School of Government at the University of Oxford. Robert's also a keen supporter of international dialogues, having recently come to Beijing for the International Dialogue on AI Safety. And I'm also looking forward to going to Oxford University next week to participate in a track 2 on AI co-hosted by Robert's Oxford Martin AI Governance Initiative. Last, but certainly not least, we have Matt Sheehan, who's a fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where his research covers global technology issues with a focus on China. His research projects explore China's artificial intelligence ecosystem, the future of Chinese technology policy, and the role of technology in China's political economy. Matt is undoubtedly a tour de force when it comes to China-US relations and AI. And at Concordia, we've immensely benefited from Matt's insights and are really grateful for Matt and Carnegie's work in building bridges between China and the West. So without further ado, let me start with an open question. China's AI governance landscape is complex and multifaceted. While Concordia AI's State of AI Safety in China report focuses on China's AI safety, AI development is unquestionably also a major priority for China's AI governance. So how should we understand the balance between safety and development in China's AI governance? Angela, I know this is a topic you tackle in your book, so perhaps you'd like to start us off?
Well, thank you, Kuan-Yi. It's a great pleasure to be here today, and congratulations to Concordian for releasing your latest updates on AI safety report. I am an avid reader of research from your organization, and I benefit tremendously from your previous report. And before joining today's session, I read through your latest updates, and it's really thorough. And I think that anyone who's interested in what's happening in China should read this report. It is a must read. It's so comprehensive. Even though I follow it, these developments daily, there are things that I didn't know. So I really I really want to thank you guys for all the hard work you have put into this latest report. Regard to Kuan Yi's excellent question, right? I mean, it's really hard for China to strike the balance between innovations and regulations. Although you see regulators tend to say, having regulation in place will encourage innovation because it gives assurances to investors. But in reality, this is extremely hard, particularly in the Chinese context. When we think about, the Chinese economy is at the rock bottom, and China actually went through an unprecedented tech crackdown between 2020 and 2022, and now investor sentiments are extremely low. So the whole investment community and the business community are very averse to any sort of top regulation. And that's why, despite the fact that you see the government seemingly has been introducing a lot of AI legislation, but so far the enforcement has been very scarce, very little enforcement, right? I mean, so just like the man walking on high wire at the back, this poster, which is the cover of my book, it's the Chinese government is actually walking on tightrope in trying to balance regulation, innovation, right? I mean, so there's a lot of laws in place. A lot of standards have been introduced. A lot of safety reports. A lot of paper have been written. But the big question is, how much has been enforced? What truly matters? So far, I see the directions, is quite decisively is on development and growth, and the government has been extremely cautious in imposing any form of intervention. And the main priority, however, is on information control and content moderation. But even with that, you see gradual trend of watering down the licensing regime for introducing generative AI services. So let me stop here, and I would love to hear what other panelists will talk about today. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you, Angela, for starting us off with this excellent response. And I think this is a great segue to Matt. So Matt, given your recent article exploring the roots of China's AI regulations, do you have anything to just add on top of Angela's response so far?
Yeah, I think there's a tendency, the phrase is always balance, regulation and development, or I think of it as control and development, at least in certain contexts. I don't think it's ever really a balance. It's that China tends to just swing between emphasizing one and emphasizing the other. I think of it as like a pendulum that swings between control and development. And if you look at like the last 10 years, 12, 14 years or so, you just have these periods where, say 2010 to 2013, it was very much about, okay, the internet has grown a lot. Now we need to get it under control in terms of content. Major crackdowns in 2013. Okay, we've got it under control. You have about 6 years, 2014 to 2019, where the government's all like go on tech development. Companies get a little too big for their britches in 2019, 2020. Now we need to crack down, bring it back under control for 2020 to 2022. And then I think basically at the end of 2022, beginning of 2023 is when we started to see it swing back from a control-focused approach to a development-focused approach. And this is most clearly seen in the draft versus the final generative AI regulation. The draft comes out right on the heels of ChatGPT, and it's very control-focused, very unreasonable. You just could not have built large models if that had been passed and enforced that way. By the time you get to the final version in July, or the interim version in July, they'd significantly watered down that regulation on several fronts. And I think the last at least 6 to 9 months has really been this push back towards a development-focused agenda. They're never gonna kind of fully give up on the control side of things, especially when we're talking about content control. So I think what's interesting about this moment is that they're not just going to go, they're not going to give up on the control. They're going to try to sort of have the cake and eat it too, or they're going to try to thread the needle here with more sophisticated technical standards or technical requirements. requirements. So these standards that have been rolling out saying how to comply with the generative AI regulation that mandate this pre-deployment testing, ask the model 1,000 questions about sensitive issues. It has to have a 90% pass rate. They're trying to essentially ensure the content security of the models, but give companies a clear roadmap for how to comply, and then say, if you're not doing a content-focused application, go out, build companies, make money, stimulate the economy. That's how I see it at the moment.
Great, thanks, Matt. I just want to continue on China's domestic AI landscape for a bit more. And so in our report, we split up China's domestic AI governance landscape into overarching national guidance, national regulations and policies, science and technology ethics, standards, and local government actions. And so turning to you now, Jeff, you've been closely following the Chinese AI landscape since at least 2018 through your China AI newsletter. I'd just be curious to hear from you how you would approach analyzing China's domestic AI governance landscape and which parts of the domestic governance puzzle you pay the most attention to and why.
Great, yeah. Really excited to be here. Let me just pick up on two of these threads because I think this is a really good conversation. One is, are we scoping the discussion to AI safety, right? Because when we're talking about controlling content, that doesn't really fit for me in the first in the first row of narrow AI for really dangerous purposes, such as using narrow AI to better engineer bioweapons, or the frontier AI risks. So oftentimes when you talk about safety, like nuclear safety, space safety, aviation safety, you're talking about preventing accidents, right? A model outputting something that should be censored in the Chinese context is not an accident, right? An accident that we're talking about when we talk about AI safety is like OpenAI's Coast Runner example, where the boat playing a video game to try to collect all the different coins figures out through reinforcement learning that the best way to accumulate points is actually just to crash into all these different objects. So what's interesting about this area, and this I want to bounce off of Angela's discussion here, is like, what are we comparing China's balance to? What is the baseline, right? If the baseline is the US, is the US White House executive order being enforced? Do we have anything like an algorithm registry in the US? If the baseline is the EU, that's a very different story, right? So I think it's very hard for any country to do proactive governmental regulation on a technology safety issue where we haven't seen a concrete accident. Think about legislation before Bhopal and the chemical accidents. Think about legislation in the aviation industry before some of those earliest accidents. And it's even hard sometimes for people and regulators, and there's existing debates over what an accident in AI even looks like. So I think, right, Concordia, this report, I agree with everyone. You all have developed so much primary source data for all these developments, right? But when we're talking about how has China struck that balance, we need to take into account those two principles I just outlined. Are we scoping it to AI safety? And then what are we comparing China to, right? If we're saying that China favors development, what is the baseline? And being really precise about what standard we're holding China to.
Thanks, Jeff. I think that's really good sort of nuancing of the premise of the question. I guess since this is gearing towards Concordia's report here, I wonder if, Jason, you have anything just to add.
No, I think the comments by everyone have been super interesting, and totally agree in a lot of ways. I think the one thing that I would add is, I guess, yeah, talking about balance between development and security or safety. There's also balance between, say, content safety and security versus sort of frontier safety and security. And we focus on the latter in the report, but certainly there are places you can see everywhere sort of that both of them are being sort of emphasized to different extents in different ways. So for instance, the standard that Matt referenced on generative AI safety and security, there's a standard on generative AI safety and security that had various quantitative sort of requirements for content security, but also it said that there are long-term risks from AI in terms of, I believe, referencing bioweapons, chemical weapons, and some of these frontier risks that we talked about. So they talk about those frontier risks in like the opening paragraph, but then they don't actually, the standard doesn't yet have any mechanisms to actually test for those risks or prevent them from occurring. But if we compare it to, and I guess this is back to like what we compare it to. If we compare it to standards that we might have expected from a year ago or 2 years ago, I don't think you'd see any reference of frontier risks. And so you're seeing greater awareness of some AI safety concerns, but not necessarily getting to the point where there are mechanisms to actually test for them or actually meaningfully sort of prevent the risk from happening. But again, the accident has not happened yet, as Jeff noted. And so it's hard to prevent something that you don't know exactly what it's going to look like at the end of the day.
Great, thanks, Jason. I want to shift gears a little bit here. So, Robert, you previously were interviewed by Time Magazine on why China's involvement in the UK AI Safety Summit was so significant. And so now, as we're hot off the heels of another major international AI governance event, the US-China Intergovernmental Dialogues on AI, can you just share your thoughts on the significance of this event as well and China's role in international AI safety and governance more broadly?
Yeah, absolutely. And let me just first say that I've learned so much from your reports, and I'm so glad you're doing them, and I'm so glad the organization exists. Yeah, I mean, I think China has a sort of a very important role to play across the board and in really all areas of AI governance. And maybe I'd start with standards development. Somebody said it's like, that is the position we're in right now as a world, is sort of like trying to develop standards for a car while the car is in motion. That is, the pace of development is so fast. And it's not what standards organizations traditionally do. They distill insights from a sort of existing field of knowledge. And yet in this case, we're trying to develop standards really at the frontier of technology. And so I just think that's a task for the whole world, for us all to be working on, and for us all to be thinking about high-level principles, things like red lines, something that some of the Track 2 dialogues have focused on a little bit, and you know, those issues of, well, you know, at a high level, what should principles look like around this technology? Since the technology is affecting everyone, they're just questions for everyone, and certainly for China. And then I think there's another sense in which cooperation is particularly important with China. I mean, China is a place where AI development is happening. After US firms, Chinese firms are the largest source of computing power for advanced AI in the world. So, you know, if we think about trying to regulate this technology, if we think about, for instance, suppose there was an actor that was trying to get around a governance regime, be it a domestic or an international governance regime, they might structure training so that so that a model is being trained across borders so that neither local jurisdiction realizes exactly what's going on. And so it'd be very helpful if we were collaborating internationally to try to understand these things and pursue such actors and make sure that governance was working effectively. And China has simply an essential role to play there. And I think, you know, last thing I'll say is that, you know, we don't just need standards, we need to internationalize them in the sense of having incentives for adoption at the international level. And that's another place where we all really need to collaborate in order to make that work, just like we do in other areas and other industries.
Thank you so much, Robert. And Matt, I know that Carnegie and you also are a great promoter of international coordination in general and including on AI. And you've been also in touch with some Chinese interlocutors yourself through your work. I'd love to hear your perspective on this question as well. What do you think China's role in international AI safety and governance is in the world?
Yeah, maybe I'll make 2 points on this. One about just kind of the scope of issues. I think maybe the most important thing that we need to do at the start is dramatically scope down what we are trying to govern internationally. I think the vast majority of AI policy issues are just going to be fundamentally domestic issues, and trying to sort of drag them into international debates is just not going to be very productive. Even the US and Europe, which are very in some ways politically, in some ways culturally similar, have highly different policies when it comes to content moderation, when it comes to sort of labor market practices, all kinds of things. So I think the first thing is just getting a lot of the stuff that we're not going to agree on out of the international governance debates, and basically just scope it down to transnational safety focused risks, things that are that no country can solve alone, that each country thinks it is in their interest to resolve, and that they cannot solve on their own. So that's the first thing. When it comes to China's role, and maybe I'll speak specifically here about the US-China dynamic, because it's on my mind with the AI governance dialogue that just started yesterday. I think one mistake that we sometimes make is thinking that the key thing is that we sort of get in the room together at a high level, and then we strike sort of a high level bargain between the two leaders. And then once we make that bargain, there's going to be safety within both of the ecosystems. We're going to trickle down within the ecosystems. I'm very, very skeptical of that. I think if a high level bargain happens, it's not going to be because it started at the top and went down. It's going to be because both countries independently or in parallel developed safe policies, safe AI development policies and regulations that get sort of built up through their domestic regulatory systems. And then when we have a certain level of alignment, then we end up kind of formalizing that at the top. And I think that doesn't mean that there's not a room for dialogue. I think there's tons of room for dialogue, especially at the track 2 level, for both sort of policy advisors, experts to exchange best practices, to explain like, why are we taking this regulatory approach? What results are we seeing? To have scientists engaging on sort of red lines or sort of paths towards safer development. I'm a big fan of the international dialogues on AI safety work. I think that's some of the most important work, getting together sort of elite scientists and elite policy advisors in both countries. But yeah, I think sort of switching the framing from let's get together, figure it out, and then put that on both of our systems to like, let's build it up within our systems in some level of coordination and some in parallel, but not sort of in lockstep.
Yeah, thank you so much, Matt. And I think I just want to build on your theme here of opening to international cooperation and wrap up our panel here with a final question. So given upcoming international summits, such as the Seoul AI Summit and UN Summit of the Future, what are the key challenges and opportunities for international coordination you see on AI safety and governance? And I know all of our panelists are advocates for greater international coordination and have written or spoken about the topic before. So I'd really like to hear from each of you on this question. Jeff, perhaps you'd like to start us off?
Yeah. So, I think it's I wouldn't, not to be nitpicky, but I'm not sure if if international coordination in all respects is going to be good or bad. Like Matt was saying, kind of targeting international coordination on specific issues, I think is really going to be crucial. It's hard for me to picture how things are going to play out. So oftentimes I will rely on historical examples to figure out where we should be going and what we should be focusing on. I think in this space, one thing I go back to a lot is the US and the Soviet Union cooperated quite a bit on nuclear safety and security issues. And one of the venues was through this joint verification experiment, where scientists at the nuclear weapons labs of both countries visited each other's labs and tried to make sure that they could verify the accuracy and the reliability of nuclear tests. And so it wasn't just people getting together to talk. It wasn't just consensus statements. It was building relationships through doing activities together. And a lot of the panelists have, highlighted some of those examples, like red teaming exercises. Other things would be like maybe like on-chip verification exercises in AI safety and security. And the value of that type of dialogue was the relationships that were formed of people who were actually working on the frontier of the technology itself of nuclear weapons. They had built relationships with each other. And then actually when the Soviet Union collapsed, those relationships continued, and the US was able to offer support to the Russian Federation now on securing and making nuclear weapons in former Soviet Union republics safer. So that could be one model of how we think about US-China engagement in the space.
Thank you. And maybe just working through my Zoom thumbnails. Matt, can you have a go?
Yeah, I think where my head is at right now is that a real focus on testing and evaluation. I think we have lots of principles, and developing principles is good, and it provides sort of touch points and benchmarks, and not benchmarks, provides touch points. It provides a framework by which people talk about these issues, and I think that is important. But I think for the next phase of this, in the US-China bilateral context, and then maybe also in the international context, getting people together getting engineers, scientists together to figure out what are the best ways to test and evaluate for whether it's dangerous capabilities or at sort of the frontier or more narrow dangerous capabilities. So I think exercises where you have say the people building evaluations at places like the Center for AI Safety in the US, and maybe it's at CAICT in China, or maybe it's the Shanghai AI Lab, getting those people together to talk about what are the currently most reliable ways that we know to test the models for undesirable capabilities, because anyone who works in testing evaluation will tell you that the field is just, I was about to say a joke. It's definitely not a joke. It's very serious. But most people say it is an extremely crude and rudimentary science that needs a lot of work and a lot of collaborative work. And that's one area where I would put a lot of focus going forward.
Thank you. And Angela, maybe you could share your thoughts on this as well.
Well, I definitely agree that international cooperation is critical in AI safety, and because of my view that I predict Chinese AI regulation will be quite lax, unless something really bad happens, as Jeff mentioned. And so I actually think that international cooperation is even more important, particularly in engaging with China. And particularly when we think about, the computing power is quite scarce in China right now, firms will be even more reluctant to devote sufficient computing resources to safety testing. And so I just think that international community should engage with China more to understand what China is doing. However, as the historical the example that Jeff just mentioned, if you want to get China on the table, the US would need to give some incentives for China to do that. But the current Sino-US tech rivalry and the rounds of US export restrictions on NVIDIA's chips to China is making it extremely hard for the two countries to achieve any meaningful progress on international cooperation. So despite the fact that we did see very promising results with nuclear non-proliferation control, however, when it comes to say AI, I'm less optimistic, particularly because unless something really bad happens, where every country the leaders from every country wake up to realize the severity of AI safety risk, then I think that it's really hard to achieve meaningful progress, unfortunately.
Thank you. I wonder, Robert, do you have a perhaps more optimistic or different take to close up on this question here?
Well, I find so many areas of agreement, but let me say just one particular area of agreement that I think we do need to sort of figure out what standards we really want to internationalize, because we don't need to agree on every single thing. In many areas, it's just a good thing if societal values are reflected in local regulation. And for instance, in the area of privacy, we see that Europe and the US have gone different ways in many cases, and that's, I think, fine. And so we need to sort of hone in on these areas, and safety collaborations is certainly probably one where we kind of do need to internationalize things. I guess I would just say, I think I sort of think about what we need internationally in three areas. And so I'll just say very quickly that these are the sort of three areas that I think it would be really good to go in. And we've been talking a little bit about standards, and I think that's already an area where there is in effect lots of collaboration on international standards through places like the ISO and other international standards organizations. But when it comes to safety standards, which we were just talking about, that's a particularly challenging area for these organizations like the ISO. And it sort of looks like maybe, for instance, organizations like the ACs are going to have a large role to play in developing those sorts of standards, and that they might develop into a kind of a network. And so organizations within China, like the BAAI, the Beijing Academy of AI, that may play a similar role to the ACs, I think that establishing those networks is I think very important to the development of really international standards. Second thing is a reporting regime. I think that is something that's already starting to happen internationally, and the OECD now is starting to play a role there. But we really need a reporting regime that is broad-based and includes China. And that should be reporting by both developers and compute providers, because when one reports, it can be checked by the other. And I think that'll be a much more robust sort of regime that would be in, I think, common interest. And then I think thinking a little bit about, and it's maybe an ambitious goal, thinking about organizations like ICAO, these organizations that, and it's not just ICAO, there are others, but these organizations that are sort of auditing domestic regulations that are important from, let's say, a safety point of view, or important across nationally, to make sure that there are appropriate regulations. And in some cases that those regulations are being enforced. And then when there aren't appropriate regulations, helping those nations to build a better and more effective regulatory systems. Those sorts of organizations, I think, could be, as I say, an ambitious goal for collaboration, but I think worth thinking about even in the near term.
Thank you so much. I think we are in agreement with a lot of these suggestions on international coordination, and I really hope that participants can take these away as food for thought. But I just want to ask one final question here to all panelists, and it's that we believe here at Concordia that improved understanding of China's rapidly evolving views and positions on AI safety and governance are really essential for the success of all these international coordination endeavors. In order for there to be successful coordination, I think there will also need to be better understanding of each other. And so I think there are often misconceptions about China's AI ecosystem and governance approach. And so I really want to ask each panelist, what are some common misunderstandings you've encountered, and how does your understanding differ from those misconceptions? And we'll just sort of bust some of these myths to leave the audience with to wrap up the panel. Maybe Jeff, we could start off with you again, just based on, again, your extensive tracking of China's AI landscape. So common misunderstandings you've encountered and how your understanding might differ from these misconceptions.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest misunderstandings that I think this Concordia report is a prime rebuttal to is just that there is an all systems go green light for development of AI in China, and there's no interest in AI safety issues. There's no organizations working on AI safety issues. And I think the report does well to dispel that misconception. I think the next step we have to go, though, is then, like, we have all this data now, right? For example, like in this report, you have this great methodology of identifying 11 relevant groups, labs, universities that are focused on frontier AI safety, right? I think the next step we have to go, and this goes to Robert's point, does China have an institution that can be as robust as an AI safety institute that we have in the US or the UK? The next step is, let's not just study China in isolation. Let's try to develop some comparison. Obviously, it's hard to compare across cultures and country contexts, but for example, how many relevant frontier safety groups would you identify in the UK or in the US, right? Just to give a sense of, okay, it's easy to combat the misperception of there's nothing happening in China. The harder thing to do is, how do you contextualize that and say, what is China doing in comparison to this other country or this other country? And I think that's where we have to go.
Great. And Robert, I'd also love your thoughts here, maybe especially from your experience participating in dialogues with Chinese interlocutors. What do you think is something that Western audiences overlook with regard to China's AI strategy, either that be domestically or on the international stage?
Yeah, I guess I think Jeff's point was a great one. Maybe another is that I just think there's a sense that that most of the sort of forefront of governance efforts are just happening in the West, and I think a lot of people are just they see the EU AI Act, they see the executive order, they see the White House commitments, and they're quite aware of these things, and the sorts of things that China actually has been doing for a while. Things like the algorithm registry, which Matt has written about, are really actually at the leading edge of the sorts of things that we might want to do, taking Angela's point that we have to really worry about enforcement, and absolutely. But you know, as Jeff says, enforcement is something that, including with the EU AI Act, I mean, I have many questions about how enforcement, even though in form it looks like they're enforcement provisions, but when you actually think about, well, how are they going to get transparency into what firms are doing? What is enforcement really going to look like, and will it be supported? I think we really don't know yet. So I think, you know, there's this sort of perception that that all of the governance innovation is happening in the West, but actually there's, I think, a number of interesting things that are going on in China, particularly the algorithm registry, but other things also that really are worth thinking about. And maybe the last thing I'll just mention is just generally the interest in cooperating. I think there's such a perception of rivalry now in the West, and as a result of that, I think there's a perception of an unwillingness to cooperate on China's part, and certainly in the dialogues that I've been a part of, and at least the people that we've been talking to, we haven't found that to be the case at all. There's a real openness to discussing possibilities for governance. So maybe those are the two that come to mind, but I'm sure there are many others.
Thank you. And I'd love to hear from our other panelists as well, just common misconceptions you might have encountered and your different perspective.
I would just say the idea that AI governance in China is very top down. Central leadership comes up with a plan, and that's just imposed on the system. I think that's a misconception. It's a much more complex policy ecosystem, and a lot of the top sort of sets a direction of travel. It's the ultimate back line for things, but a lot of the real work in formulating policy happens in a policy ecosystem that looks in some ways a lot like other international US policy ecosystems. Obviously, China, very different context, very different political context, very different speech context. But you know, it's an ecosystem with academics, professors, think tanks, that in an area like AI policy, it still remains a very open debate with a lot of back and forth, a lot of critical thinking and creative thinking about how to put together AI policy that fits within the ecosystem.
Yeah.
Yeah, let me add my final words. My views are actually a little bit provocative. So there's a common perception that Chinese regulation is always bad for businesses. But when I look at the latest Chinese AI legislation, like the interim measure to regulate generative AI, I actually see this as a enabling, it's a law that trying to enable the Chinese AI industry. And in fact, I think this law, the way I read it, offer very little protective values for the Chinese public. It mostly serves the purpose of, I call it expressive power, to signal to the industry that China is pro-development rather than pro-regulation, as well as to try to coordinate different industry participants to forge ahead with AI development. So when we read the Chinese law, I mean, particularly when we try to understand China's AI regulatory landscape, it's important not to take the law too literally. Just based on my years of experience as a Chinese law scholar, I think it's more important to read the tea leaves from the law, and the policy signaled from the law actually matters way more than the black letter law. Yeah.
Yeah. Jason, I'll let you just close off here.
Yep. Just jumping in real quick. Sorry, just jumping in real quick. Just love the discussion. I wish we could talk about it with a lot more with each and every one of you. I guess the one misperception that I will highlight is that disagreement with China on one aspect of AI governance does not mean that sort of global AI governance or international agreement and dialogue on AI governance is useless, right? So as I think folks mentioned earlier, right, disagreements on what constitutes privacy, what constitutes politically correct or incorrect content, differing perceptions of these does not mean that it's impossible or useless to talk about international standards on things, on transnational threats, on terrorist misuse of AI systems, potentially in the future, and also in terms of loss of control of advanced AI systems. And so I think there's definitely, a lot of panelists mentioned these sorts of topics as things that, there's probably more impetus for international standards on. And I think disagreement on other aspects should not preclude international standards on these important and pressing topics.
Fantastic. Okay, well, thank you so much to all the panelists. Now I'll open up to audience questions. We've really gotten a flood of questions, so I apologize in advance if we don't get to your specific question, but I'll also try to group them as we go. So first question, someone cited Robert's recent report on governing through the cloud, the role of compute providers in AI regulation, where this report proposed an AI governance framework using market access as a tool to implement the common rules. Is it feasible to have these rules considering today's geopolitical situation, or if the quote-unquote common rules excludes China, will it lead to further fragmentation of AI governance, just as we've learned through data governance? This is just a question from someone that I've read pretty much ad verbatim. Perhaps, Robert, since this references your report, you'd like to have a go at this question?
Yeah, I'm happy to have a go at this. I mean, so I think this is one of these areas, some of us on the call have talked about this before, compute governance has this connotation of, thinking about the export of chips and things like this, but there's this other area of it where we're thinking about this common problem that all countries have in terms of using the computing infrastructure as a kind of intermediary between governments and AI firms, and as a site for governance. And I just think that there's just so much common interest here. It really is, to me, the analogy is very much thinking about things in finance, like money laundering or something like that. It's much, much easier to catch money laundering if there's international coordination to do it. And there's a ton of different structures internationally that aid in this. There's something called the Egmont Group, which involves all these finance intelligence units speaking to each other. There are bilateral agreements. As a matter of fact, the US and China have a bilateral agreement that aids in information sharing in that area. There is the FATF that is doing some related things. And so I think in terms of comment, so just to sort of get at the core of what I take to be the question, there is a ton of common interest that I hope we will get to a place where we can have a broad-based regime. But there is sort of knee-jerk skepticism about the possibility of a broad-based regime. And so I think some governments, particularly in the West, are targeting other sort of more local sorts of groupings for these sorts of collaborations. But as I say, the collaborations, particularly in the area of compute, where China is such a significant actor, would simply be much more effective and in everybody's interests if they were broader.
Great, thank you. I'll combine a few of the audience questions here into one, and we'll start off by asking Matt this question because I know you need to leave on the dot. So the question is, how can we make sure activities that the panelists are talking about, I imagine the cooperative activities that the panelists are talking about, are not withdrawn from as a result of other escalatory actions such as export controls, trade restriction, taken by either China or the US in future? What are potential blockers from China's point of view? For example, what could the West do to make collaboration easier?
I think it's going to be key to not make safety something that America is asking China to do and trying to incentivize China to do, because that's just not a solid foundation on which to build this. The Chinese government is going to need to decide of its own accord that safety is something that it desires and that it will pursue and that it sees as a value. If the whole time it's the US saying, please, please, please come do this, and China saying, well, we will if you loosen export controls on semiconductors, that's just it's not going to work, because in many cases, I don't think the US is going to do it, or lead to a huge backlash in the US if we do it. And it's creating a dynamic in which China isn't pursuing safety for the right reasons, and I think that can be a long-term undermining thing. So my current position is if China does not want to engage on it sort of for the merits of it, then don't turn it into this bargaining chip that China kind of is going to give and then withdraw and give and then withdraw. It turns it into a different kind of thing, and I don't think that will make real progress on. Other blockers. I think one thing is just the willingness to allow China to engage in international fora. They're very clear that if you create international fora and exclude us from those international fora, you create international fora to exclude us, then we are not going to view those fora as legitimate. So this is why I think it's a very big deal that they were invited to the UK AI Safety Summit. If you make that a thing that is defined as excluding China, then that is not going to be an area where this can continue to work. There are going to be some things that China does not participate in international governance, but on safety issues specifically, it needs to be inclusive, and it needs to not sort of hold that hostage to China doing other things that we think are nice.
Right, thanks so much, Matt. I do want to have someone else also attempt this question. I really like it just because it recognizes the potentially difficulty, the challenges with the geopolitical climate at the time, while realizing that perhaps despite the challenges, there are still areas in which I believe countries do need to try to come to terms with to better coordinate on safety for the global public interest. And so, yeah, just opening this up to the floor now, really. If anyone's interested in taking it, that'd be great.
I want to just echo everything that Matt said. I thought that was very well put. Just to give one specific example, right now there are concerns over track 2 dialogues that are focused on AI safety issues, whether people on the whether the entity list prevents participants from both sides from participating in those track 2 dialogues. So there are efforts to try to clarify that AI safety is a protected space in those conversations, so it's not being limited by these trade restrictions. So I think that's one concrete scenario that's playing out right now in terms of how you can ensure joint activities like track 2 dialogues still progress on AI safety issues and are not hindered by the entity list restrictions.
Great. Angela, do you have a final word to say on this before we wrap up?
I want to slightly push back what Matt said about cooperation. I do think that if we look at the non-proliferation of nuclear, cooperation, we do see countries trying to give some incentives to each other in order to facilitate cooperation, right? I mean, so in the context of US and China, if, say, we want to create a regime to monitor the non-proliferation of frontier models, and in order to entice China to participate in this regime, I don't think the reliance on domestic incentives is sufficient, given there's its institutional contacts. I think that giving both, I don't know, it's hard for US to give US already giving a lot of sticks to China. I think it needs to give some carrots to China to participate in such a management control. Well, particularly if we consider the past examples of international cooperation.
Great. Thank you so much, Angela. Welcome your pushbacks throughout this whole discussion. And I think with that, we'll end the webinar for today. Thank you so much to everyone in the audience for staying up until the end. And thank you, Jason, for the presentation and Brian for the introduction. But definitely thank you most of all to our wonderful panelists, Jeff, Matt, Robert, Angela. You're all fantastic. Again, couldn't have thought of a better team. So great to have you. And with that, we'll wrap up our webinar for today. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks very much.
Thanks,
again,
everyone. Congratulations again, guys.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Bye, everyone.